Brad Carlson is a regional-based extension educator working in the water resources area with a focus on issues related to soils, fertility, water quality, and drainage. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks, Bruce. We'll see how I do on being on time. This presentation could be a little clunky. I have not given this before, so we'll see what happens. This is really more of a discussion conversation about on-farm research. I'm not going to be presenting specific results for specific projects. I have worked on a lot of different projects over the years, and so a lot of this is going to be observational. I'm going to try to be vague regarding some of the things I've experienced. It's not my intention to poke fun at anybody or embarrass anybody about some of the things that have happened in the past. However, I think everybody finds it kind of useful to draw on some of those experiences. I think historically, those of us in extension, and I've been in 30 years now, we hear a lot of this, that worked on the experiment station, but my farm is different, or my soils, hybrid, drainage, weeds, pests, the weather I experienced, whatever that might be, is different than the study. My favorite ones are we get guys who say, I'm better than you guys are, I can make that work. And then we get other people who say, well, those plots you have out there are manicured and micromanaged. Of course you're going to find that. And those are two completely contrasting things. But we also know that there's a lot of people out there, to use kind of the Apostle Thomas analogy, that are just simply not going to believe it until they do it themselves. Like, yeah, I believe those research results, but I'm still not going to do that on my farm until I've tried it and I've seen that it worked. This being the nitrogen conference, I think really we're kind of gearing this towards is doing your own on-farm nitrogen rate trials. If you're looking at adjusting your rates, one of the concepts that I know that we're going to be kind of talking a lot more about in the future, it's been a topic of conversation for the last few years, is the correlation between the total rate needed and the yield you can achieve at zero nitrogen. People are not really going to be inclined to want to plant an entire field at zero or a large area at zero just to find out what their yield potential is. And so it is likely that you may be using some of that kind of stuff in the future, looking at it, trying to determine just what that zero potential is in an individual field. So a lot of this is going to be just discussion of some of the stuff that we've seen and done in the past, as well as kind of some tips and some guidelines on how you can set something up on yourself. Historically, we in Extension have been doing off-station research really ever since the beginning of Extension. I mean, it's been going on for over 100 years. There's not enough land. And there are always going to be projects that are going to be located on farmers' own fields. So it's not like everything we've done up until the last few years has always been done on the research stations. That's been out there for a very long time. I think, we realize that historically we've done a lot of small plot work. Really, if you see those research sites on some of the on-farm fields, frequently they're designed exactly the same as they would be at a research station, but it does get over to the fact of, well, then it is on somebody else's farm and conditions and so forth that it's going to experience. And so really it does kind of fill the need of some of that, that my whatever is different. I do want to point out that we've also been doing on-farm demonstration work for a very, very long time. However, demonstration work really involves sort of a settled research question, like we've decided this is the thing you should be doing or using. Now we're going to put it out in some farmers' fields. We'll come back in the summer and we'll have a conversation about it. That's really not on-farm research. And so I also want to point that out for what you're doing on your own farm. That just simply putting something out there that you've never done before is really not technically on-farm research. It's just sort of trying things out and seeing what your opinion is of that. But you do need to be kind of careful about how far you can go with it when it's not actually a designed research project. It's just a different practice that you're trying out. I think we all realize that the advent of the yield monitor, roughly about 25 years ago, has really changed the farmer's ability to do this stuff themselves. You know, historically, you had to be pretty ambitious if you wanted to do an on-farm research project, and you know, in a lot of cases, a lot of the folks who were doing that were going to be ended up connected with a seed company or a co-op or somebody else that was actually trying something, or maybe had a background in research, and were really going you know, the extra mile to put all that design and analysis work in to do on-farm stuff. But you know, the idea that now you can just simply produce a yield map and pluck your numbers off of the yield map really has kind of changed the game for farmers. You know, the thing I think you have to first recognize, though, is that you can define plots in a field and find differences without doing anything. You know, this is a field I've used this picture a lot. This is only about 1.5 miles or 2 miles from my house. You can see very clearly that there's a dividing line as you go up the hill as we change soil types there as far as the response. And so, you know, we know that you could just, and this field I'm absolutely certain was managed identically across the field, yet you're seeing some very different a very distinct pattern there in the corn growth and what's going on there late in the season. And so, you know, the fact that you could plunk strips or plots out in a field and find differences without ever doing any modification of your practices is something you have to keep in the back of your mind, because if what you really want to answer is, did this change or did this practice have a yield advantage or disadvantage, you have to eliminate the fact that the change in yield may not be related to that practice. So, you know, the gold standard for that reason has always been to use small plots, you know, and it's funny, while for quite a long time we were getting a lot of push to do bigger plots and strip plots and whole farm research, you know, all of a sudden now a lot of the people who've been pushing that have been saying, well, there were too many variables out there. Really, we need to go back to small plots so we can control the variables and actually answer the question. And so I guess that's something I want you to kind of keep in mind with that the bigger the plots are, when we get close to field edges, when we have varying topography, you can start bringing in some differences that aren't related to the treatment that you put on out there. So again, you know, a nitrogen rate trial run on this field, you're probably going to see two very different responses there from the foot slope and the side and top slope of this hill. You have to be very careful analyzing that, but frankly, this just simply is a bad candidate to even use at all for on-farm research. So let's talk a little bit about just simply from doing a research project in general. Select your question. What is your treatment? You need to be very specific with that. Sometimes these things get kind of vague, but you know, very particularly if you're saying I've been putting on 200 pounds of nitrogen following soybeans, and you know, we're hearing these recommendations that I could easily get away with 175 or 150. I'm going to just simply compare 200 to 150. Okay, that's a very specific treatment. However, if you say, well, we're going to do that, and we're going to do some weed control differences and a couple of fungicides, now all of a sudden this is changed and it's become kind of problematic as far as whether you're actually going to be able to answer the question given the experimental design. You need to control or eliminate the variables as best as you can. That kind of, again, is one of the reasons why we do research on small plots, to avoid soil differences, drainage differences. It does allow us to really manage pests, weeds, and insects down to a zero level so that they didn't impact the results. And so when we get on a whole field basis, that can be problematic, that we know there's weed patches and that maybe there's an effect of the neighboring crop. You know, potentially you had overwintering corn rootworm that migrated over from the nearby field, the neighboring field, and the corn rootworm problem is worse on the east side than it is on the west side or something like that. So we got to be kind of careful about trying to eliminate those variables that can cause yield differences that are not related to the treatment that you put out there. Replicating and randomizing. You know, the replication part does get back to the whole issue of what kind of variability are you experiencing out there that's just simply based on the soil type and the topography and so forth. That the more times that you actually run your question, the bigger average you can get that's potentially going to eliminate those. The randomization part is to get away from the fact that there could be a pronounced gradation across the field. So if we see that it goes from wet to dry and you're just simply running your treatments in order, you're going to also bias those in the order that you're running from wet to dry or from low to high in topography or whatever that may be, gradations in soil types, organic matter, some of those things. And so really replicating and randomizing the treatments in small plot research is just simply done to try and get rid of or eliminate any of the variables that we were not able to eliminate, or the things, there's things that happen out there that we don't even understand that can cause differences. And it's important to try and get away from that. Quality control. When we talk about the on-farm stuff, this is really probably the biggest thing, you know, the biggest takeaway I've had is the ability to actually know that you did what you thought you did out there, that we're not having screw-ups going on. You know, the small plot stuff does allow us to actually try and get rid of a lot of that by having it in a very small area. You know, we can micromanage those plots and make sure that the treatments happen exactly the way we wanted them to happen and the placement of things were right. Again, the quality control includes making sure that if you're doing nitrogen work that your weed control didn't get out of hand or you didn't end up with some kind of an insect problem that impacted this and so forth. And so that's important. And then, of course, the statistical analysis at the end is an important element of research as far as whether we're actually able to pronounce, did we actually see a difference or not? And this isn't a statistics talk, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through that stuff. Sometimes we'll hear farmers say, well, I have a whole system and I want to compare what I do compared to what the neighbor does. And now all of a sudden we're talking about, you know, well, he does, you know, he does 2-pass tillage on his bean stubble and he's putting on fall nitrogen, and I only do 1-pass and I'm putting on spring, and he likes to put on a fungicide and I don't do that. I don't think I need to. And now all of a sudden you're talking about varying about 4 things. And so, you know, the question is can you even research that? Yeah, you can. But what you need to remember is you can only go so far is pronouncing differences that you found. So, you know, probably the biggest thing is if you actually are doing a system research, to make sure you actually follow the system, because I've been involved with some of this stuff before where they said like, well, yeah, you know, the part of this system involves fall nitrogen and this one involves spring nitrogen, but we couldn't get the co-op to come out twice. So we just did it all in the fall and then we changed this other stuff. Well, now all of a sudden you didn't actually investigate the system because you didn't follow up with the practices that were part of the system that you thought that you were doing. You know, probably the kicker though, when we're doing this system type research is, was there interaction between the differences, the variables that you had out there in your treatments, or was it just a single input that made the difference? And that can be very, very difficult to say that actually this whole system that we used, you know, involving manure and cover crops and whatever was different than the system of conventional, where we did just conventional tillage and commercial fertilizer out there. Do you know that it was the manure that made a difference? Do you know it was the cover crop that made a difference? Do you know that it was something relative to your planting date that made a difference? All of those things can be very difficult to tease out. And so I guess maybe the bottom line is I would like to discourage you from actually doing a research question that involves a system where lots of things change, because in the end, it gets to be very difficult to interpret those results. When we do systems research from from the university standpoint, we have what's called a factorial design, which is changing various inputs one at a time, so we can tease out whether it actually was the system that changed or whether it was one specific input. You've heard of these kitchen sink type research projects where they look at high rates of N and multiple fungicide treatments and all the insect control, whether we thought we needed it or not, and so forth. And so in the end, if you get a yield difference, do you know whether it was because you did all that stuff or because you did one of those things? And so without that kind of a design, it's very hard to say that. And so these, in a lot of cases, these factorial research projects end up having hundreds of plots. I mean, some of these things that like Fred Belo's done down in Illinois, I mean, it's just a monster as far as from a research standpoint. Very, very difficult thing that a farmer would think that they're going to actually do something like that on their own field. And so again, I'm going to just kind of discourage you from thinking about doing that. Well, let's talk a little bit about quality control. And I'm going to start by talking about what happens with small plots. First of all, we have to avoid using the same area over and over again, because how do we know that last year's research didn't impact the results this year and it had nothing to do with our treatment? Okay, and another thing is if there is speed is an issue with the treatment, make sure that the plot's big enough. The picture I got there is a two-shank DMI ripper that we've used for small plot tillage research. Now, does that ripper do the same thing if it's barely crawling across the field as it does if you get the thing up to 4 or 5 miles an hour? No. Okay, so if you're actually doing tillage research and you're using a piece of equipment like that, you actually want it to get up to speed so it's actually shattering the soil and casting the the soil aside at the shanks the way it would in a field condition, not when you're barely creeping along. And so we have to be careful about some of that stuff. Similarly, if you're switching nitrogen rates, what was the changeover from the rate, from one plot to the next? We like to have borders or alleys in between them to allow for some of that, but that's something to be cognizant of. What do you do with the borders? So if you're doing a fungicide evaluation, once the sprayer gets moving across the field, it's fine. But if you're at a dead stop and you turn the thing on and get going, what about that first 5-6 feet before you get up to speed? Is that really representative of the rest of the plot? No, probably not. So when we do small plot research, we'll typically take out the first 5 or 10 feet of a plot and just get rid of the grain, because we figure that the middle of the plot is what's more indicative of the treatment. And so that's one of the ways we do quality control. What do you do with the borders? So if you've got, again, nitrogen rates, something like that, the first row of this plot and the last row of the next plot, what rate did they actually see? We usually only harvest the center rows, and that takes care of dealing with the borders. We don't use edge rows. I think most people recognize that the first couple rows in the cornfield have 2 ears per plant. That's going to be very different than when you get into the middle of the field. You don't want that messing up with your data. And so then the other question is how do you harvest? So we do have calibrated plot combines that will actually just give us a yield as we go. They do need to be calibrated routinely, and we will also harvest and dump into a weigh wagon and actually physically weigh the grain. We will also do some hand harvesting of corn, obviously on the ear, shell it, and then weigh that also. So that's kind of from the small plot version. And I think as you can start to imagine, now let's scale up and talk about all those quality control aspects if you're looking at an entire field. Okay, be careful when you're selecting the field. I already talked about this. This is a yield map I got from Gary Wagner up by Crookston. It's a great example, though, showing differences in a field that you probably should not be conducting on-farm research on. We've got a toe slope there, you've got a side slope, you've got the top of the hill off on the right-hand side, and over on the left side, we've got a low area that's flooding out. There's almost no way you could lay out plots in a field like this and end up being representative enough that you actually would know you answered your question. So you have to be cognizant of topography, drainage, pest management, fields that historically have weed control problems, fields with a history of corn rootworm problems. You know that's not ever going to be consistent across the field, that there's hot spots and patches. You don't want that impacting the results. And then the next thing is, what's your experimental design? Make sure you replicate. So we're going to, going from small plots to on-farm doesn't change this stuff. It does need to be replicated. We need to avoid having it biased by the place in the field. And so it's not just doing a single treatment in multiple fields, because your multiple fields will have different yields. If you don't do anything with them, you'll see differences. And so that is not replication. It's not splitting the field in half, because I can split the field in half and I'm going to get a yield on one side and a yield on the other, and they're not going to be the same. So was that difference caused by the treatment, or just simply because there was a difference in one half of the field versus the other? Be careful of doing that and thinking that you found an accurate result. So the first one here is a replicated strip. This is an actual research project that we did a number of years ago, where we compared a single application of nitrogen in the spring versus a flat rate of involving a pre-plant rate and a split rate, and then a variable nitrogen application rate that involved a flat rate pre and a variable rate post. And so the interesting thing I'll point out about that was we had two variables, whether you split the nitrogen and whether you variable rated the nitrogen. And so we had looked at both of those to make sure. You wouldn't want to just simply compare your single rate pre versus your variable rate split, because you didn't know if the yield difference then ended up being the result of split application or because you used variable rate. So this allowed us to actually try and tease that out. The second image here, Dan Kaiser shared that with me, is if you don't want to chew up an entire field, and particularly if you're looking at trying to discover what your yield potential is at zero nitrogen, you definitely don't want to have a large area of zero N rate out in the field. These are some designs Dan has used with infield blocks, but note that these blocks are 250 feet, so they're not small. They're big enough that they can actually, we can actually pull some yield from the middle of them and feel fairly confident that the results are accurate. The last little image here is from a presentation Joachim Wiersma gave related to a design system he came up with a number of years ago involving split planter, but that involves basically doing the same thing when we can't really replicate. For instance, he was looking at hybrids where you split the planter and half is one and half is the other, and you can't clean the planter out at the end of the field to change your randomization up at the end of the field. But you could actually take those splits. Instead of using the two splits, you'd actually take four, and then at random you'd take one from the first pass and the second, so it could have the multiple combinations as if you had randomized. That's, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through that method, but that is another way to design an on-farm experiment that involves a little less complication than trying to completely variable everything across the field. And then what are you measuring? Most cases you're measuring yield. Be cognizant of the application width that you applied, whatever that width is. If you're doing a nitrogen rate study, If you broadcast urea, was that spread at 70 feet, 90 feet, something like that? If you got a 12-row corn head out there, you know, you're trying to harvest the middle of the application area, not the edges of it, because we never know for sure if it was a windy day or if there was overlap or something like that. You want to actually answer the question you're answering. And also, I think we have to realize that as we've moved from 6-row to up to 12-row, and now there's some 16-row corn heads out there, that the detail we've got available in the field is getting coarser because it's over a wider area now than it used to be, and that's also something to be thinking about. If you're measuring differences in the soil, of course, that's something else. Or if you're measuring crop greenness, you may be flying drones out there and so forth. Again, those are all things that you need to be planning ahead of time to make sure that you're actually getting a result from the treatment area that is representative of the treatment. From a whole farm basis, it's very important to select just a single corn hybrid. You know, make sure you're not doing the business of, you know, you know, eight in the middle and then 2 different on either edge, and you know, you go across and you see that in the fields. That's kind of problematic as far as what it is you're evaluating out there. We've had farmers who ran out of one and then they switched to another. You definitely don't want that happening in the middle of the research plots that you're doing. Don't change up other inputs like pesticides or variable rate fertilizer. Very important to realize that if you are variable rating your P and K out there, particularly your phosphorus, and you're doing a nitrogen study and you're putting on MAP or DAP at variable rate, you're really messing up your total nitrogen on that field. And so that's something to stay on top of. And I personally, while I think there's great potential from a applied basis for using the See and Spray technology, I would have concerns about using that technology in a research capacity, because you can't be completely sure that you didn't end up with some weed escapes. Just simply spraying the whole thing with a single herbicide treatment will do a lot better to avoid any kind of duplication you might have out there. One of the conclusions that we have reached doing on-farm research is anything you are not doing yourself, you had better be out there when it happens. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm not saying that the input providers you have are not trustworthy, but to quote Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. You know, we trust you completely, but we're also going to be there when it happens. For the sake of talking a little bit about getting into the results or analyzing your results, it's very important to realize how your grain monitor works. It is grain striking a plate in the middle of the combine somewhere, and it is actually measuring the force that is hitting that plate as the grain is going through the machine. And so, of course, the question is at the time it's measuring that force, where was that grain in the field, you know, at that point? The combine has traveled some distance from where the grain was standing in the field to when it was striking the plate in the combine, okay? So, you know, that's all part of calibration. Now, if you're taking a wide enough area, you know, you're fine. The smaller area you have, though, the more risk you have to coming up with some kind of weird numbers that way. So again, how are you actually measuring the yield? You know, we still like to use weigh wagons. They slow you down for sure, but most of your seed dealers have access to those. The adult farm management programs in most counties have access to those. In a lot of cases, you can probably finagle the use of a weigh wagon. That's going to be a lot more precise. If you're using yield monitor data, make sure it's calibrated. I know a lot of people have said, well, that doesn't really matter a lot, because if it's off by something, you know, in this treatment, it'll be off also in that treatment, and the differences will all be the same. We've got evidence that that's not always the case. Beware of grain moisture. There's bad spots in the field, and There's areas that may have experienced low nitrogen that will show differences in grain moisture as we are measuring that grain striking that plate. The wetter it is, the heavier it is, right? And so the higher, when we hit a high grain moisture spot, it's going to actually strike that higher. Now, it should be measuring the grain moisture and correcting for that, but this gets back to your calibration again. If it was not properly calibrated, it may actually not be finding those differences out there. And we do know as a fact that there's big differences in the grain moisture based on the time of the day. So let's talk a little bit about some of the problems we've encountered in the past. And this is a very specific research project that a few of us were involved in a few years ago. And I want to go through some of the problems we encountered because I think it's instructive of things that can happen when you do your own. First of all, we had a situation where the control treatment had a different nitrogen rate than a split treatment. This was a real big problem. We inherited this research protocol. We didn't design this ourselves. But if you're doing, say, 165 pounds of nitrogen pre, and then you're doing 150 pre with a total of 200, so 50 side dress, now you don't know if you see a difference, if the difference was because you side dressed or because you applied more nitrogen. Okay, so in that particular case, bad experimental design. One of the research sites, one of the cooperators really didn't quite understand on-farm research, and when we asked him what corn hybrid got planted, he said, oh, well, there's 4 of them out there. Whoops, we're not doing a variety trial out here. We were doing a nitrogen study, okay? Created a problem. We had one case, again, this is really probably as much our fault as anybody regarding communication, that the co-op guy showed up and we normally mark our plot corners with flags. He saw flags and he centered that applicator on the flags and overhung the boom on either side of the plot. And that wouldn't have been so big of a problem, except the nitrogen rates were different on both sides. And if he was 6 inches on one, it applied one rate. And if he was 6 inches on another, it applied a different rate. And it caused this hodgepodge of nitrogen rates across the field that ended up making the treatment unable to be interpreted. And so that was the straw that broke the camel's back when we decided trust but verify. We're always going to be on site when somebody does an application. We had one of the plots where we didn't realize that the farmer didn't own a combine. He was having his field custom harvested. And we found out that the custom harvester didn't have a yield monitor on his combine. And B, when we showed up with the weigh wagon, he got extremely uptight because he had a number of fields he had to get done, and stopping to weigh individual plots was not part of what he thought he was getting hired for. Again, it gets into communication. We had situations where the co-op never sent us the as-applied fertilizer map. If it's important for you to look at that, if you're doing a fertilizer rate study, you need to get that to verify that that overlaps where your treatments were. We had a situation where when we got into the field, this was me personally, I looked over at the monitor and it said it was applying 70 feet. We knew that the treatment plots were 90 feet. Oops. Jeff had a situation where the applicator actually forgot to change over to his field map. He had been applying a flat rate on the previous field and got well into the field, and Jeff realized that it wasn't changing the rate as it went across the field, said, hey, what's up with that? Oh, yikes, I forgot to do that. Better yet, because he was over applying, he ran out of fertilizer, and even better yet, it was a Saturday afternoon. He says, well, it's too far from the co-op and there's so little of this field left, I just can't go back and get more urea and come back and finish this. Okay. Then at harvest time, we had a farmer who, while the combine was able to be outfitted with the yield monitor, he didn't have one. The implement dealer was more than willing to demo one because he was hoping to sell it to the farmer. However, when it got out there and we got out there, we got into a big argument with the implement dealer because it wasn't calibrated properly. He insisted that he was the dealer and he knew what he was doing. We demanded that the operator's manual be taken out, and of course we were correct because I'd worked with it enough. He just simply didn't want to take the time to run multiple passes across the field. And this is one of the reasons why, I'll show you some things on this yield map out here. What are you doing with your bad points? Okay, are you able to crop them out? And what is the analysis program you're using? Is it eliminating those? Are you able to crack into the database to actually get at the numbers? There's a few things going on in this field, but obviously we know that all those red points on the end didn't actually have zero yield on them, that the yield monitor started to work when you drop the corn head. And so is your program actually cutting those out when you're doing the analysis? Because you certainly don't want those points in your analysis. We use a program, it's Ag Data Management Systems from GK Technologies that actually allows us to crack into the database. Your yield monitor isn't all that complicated. It's using the GPS dome to give you a longitude and a latitude, and then it's just simply recording data points on those spots. And this is an example showing kind of what that looks like. We're able to actually get into that database and look at the distance traveled from between points, so you can see what the reading was on the press plate and the combine, and you can look at the mass, the calculated mass, wet, the grain moisture, and then it will also convert that to the mass dry, and it will then use the mass versus the distance traveled and calculate your yield in there. And so, that's kind of a way of visualizing what's actually happening out there that you're actually measuring. And so the question becomes, what is the analysis? Is it averaging these points? Because it shouldn't really be averaging them, because the distance traveled is going to be difference between the points. It should be a weighted average based on the distance traveled. As an example, this shows the difference between a yield of 179 bushels and 213. These points were 45 feet apart. And so, again, how are you handling the variability? We like to actually go into those databases, pull them into a spreadsheet, and do hand analysis on them instead of letting the computer program do it. A lot of you are probably going to turn these over to a consultant or an agronomist, somebody who's going to help you with that. There's probably not a lot of you that have expertise with your precision farming software. You're going to be able to pull that on your own. This was another site that caused us a problem. The farmer had a problem with his planter and ended up only planting 24,000 for a plant population. Then the question became, well, that's certainly not what you would be shooting for these days. What do we do? Well, because it was consistent, the population was consistent across the field, we decided it really wasn't a variable. But the bigger question is the hot yield spots. What's going on out there? And so if you look, and I don't have a laser pointer here, but I don't know if, does the arrow show up? Can you see the arrow? It's not showing up. If you look, you can see some darker blue lines kind of running through the middle in a bit of a diagonal pattern there. All right, that was where they did a tile installation. So our first inclination was, well, that tile impacted the yield where that went in there. But then we realized, does everybody see the dark blue pattern running up and down both sides? Actually, what was going on there is it was recording a higher yield every time the combine slowed down. They were slowing down to go over where that field tile was installed, and that's why we see those dark spots. So, did we have a higher yield where that tile went in? No. We had a yield monitor that was not properly calibrated because it wasn't able to accurately measure the yield based on the speed the combine was going on. This is kind of gets back to this. If you only do 1 point calibration, now all of a sudden is the data been usable? So it's something that you really need to be careful about. Applying statistics, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this. Most of you, if you're a farmer and you're doing this, you're going to come up with your averages. You can easily get the standard deviation just simply off an Excel spreadsheet. When it comes to more complicated statistical analysis, I think most of you, historically you're used to seeing the LSD, the least statistical difference, or least significant difference. from an analysis of variance. That's the number of bushels per acre. You know, if it's above this in difference, then we know that it's statistically significant. In research, we don't use that as much anymore. We're inclined to go with the p-value. But, you know, beyond just simply using your means and your standard deviation, you're probably going to come to us in the extension office to help you get those statistics. And then I think the last thing here is, does everything pass the smell test? So clearly we've got differences in strips here, but I think you have to recognize that there's also some other patterns out there also, you know, that you've got a couple of hot spots and a couple of red spots out there that are probably creating variable differences that aren't related to the treatment. They're probably more related to the topography. So you have to be careful of that. Also, I want to point out one of the earliest research projects I was involved in. This is what the yield differences were. And regardless of what the treatment was, you can see that the yield increased every single plot as we moved from south to north, okay? I don't care what the yield difference was. If you see that pattern, it was clearly more relative to where it was in the field versus what the treatment was. In addition, we did a research project where the LSD ended up only being 2 bushels an acre. You know, come on, can we really tell a difference between 2 bushels an acre? So yes, it may have been statistically significant, but when they're only 2 bushels apart, it's really hard to say that that was significant. So, so that kind of takes care of that. And I guess Bruce looks like he's trying to give me the shepherd's hook. So I need to wrap this up. But I guess the last thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was looking at on-farm research from other sources. I guess it's just important to start asking a lot of hard questions on whether they used quality control and followed the same protocol you did. You kind of know who your trusted sources are. When you see that stuff printed in a farm magazine, just simply ask a lot of questions. Using site as a replication is problematic. Be careful of qualitative data. We all know that particularly some products that we've seen lately show a lot of data where they show pictures in the field and say, look, you can see the difference. But I know personally from being an extension for 30 years that we've long been able to pick out growth differences in using starter fertilizer that did not translate into yield differences. And so we know you can take pictures during the growing season where you can see differences in the crop that don't always translate to yield. So be careful of that when it's visual data and not actually a number. Similarly, when you're just seeing these ear boards, do you know that the person really truly picked out some random ears, or that the years weren't selected to show the point they wanted to show? So that is it. There's my contact info. And then I need to move on to Slido, and maybe you don't even have time. I don't know. I will be here all day.
Let's give him a big hand and track him down if you got time.